Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening or watching the recording. My name is Kaye Estrada, and I am the Executive Director of Classy, and we're excited to be able to offer you these invitation-only conversations looking at our Module 1 ASI Theory. We will have 6 of these offered on the third Wednesday of each month, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Melisa Kaye, who's going to be giving a short introduction, presentation, and then she can answer any questions that anyone has. You can always email questions in advance to me, and we'd be happy to present those to Dr. Kaye. Dr. Kaye, we're delighted to have her with us. She has been an occupational therapist for 21 years. She is the founder and director of Firefly Center Therapy Services for Children in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's a university instructor and currently teaches at Samuel Merritt University in Oakland in the Occupational Therapy Department and at the University of San Francisco in the Educational Technology Program. She has also taught at San Jose State University and the Dominican University of California in the departments of occupational therapy. We are delighted to have Melisa with us. She brings a great knowledge and background and expertise, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Melisa to get started.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much, Katie, for that introduction. As Katie said, my name is Melisa Kaye. I'm an occupational therapist, and I have been practicing and learning about sensory integration and Ayres Sensory Integration for many years. And so for the next 6 months, once a month, I will be your guide and host as we explore various issues related to Ayres Sensory Integration and also look at some of the information from the modules in review or take a closer look or answer any questions that you might have. And as Katie said, if you do have questions, please email them to her, or at the end of the presentation, there's also my email address, and you're welcome to contact me directly. So let's get started. This first lecture will take about a half an hour maybe, and it's going to be a little bit of theory review that comes directly from the content of Module 1 of the ASI training. So to start, we ask the question, what is sensory integration? And this is Jean Ayres, who is the founder of sensory integration, which is a theory. It's a method of evaluating individuals for sensory integration difficulties, and it's also an intervention. So Jean Ayres said that sensory integration is the neurological process that organizes sensations from one's body and from the environment and makes it possible to use the body effectively in the environment. So let's unpack that a little bit. When we talk about neurological process or neurological processes, basically what that's saying is that the brain is involved, and it organizes sensations. So the senses are involved, all 8 of them, and the body is involved. So our motor systems come into play as well. So we're organizing in our brain information that's coming in through our senses and from our body and from the environment, and then we're processing it and making it possible to use our bodies effectively, in other words, motorically in the environment. So I'd like to review a little bit of terminology with you. And some of these terms you might already be very familiar with, others you might not. And if you're anything like me in your learning curve, it took me a really, really long time to be able to differentiate between the terms and understand how they related to each other. So hopefully this will be a little bit of a help. So our first term, perception, basically means the ability to distinguish and interpret sensory inputs. So perception happens on a very basic level. It's us saying, yes, something is coming in through the senses. And then on a higher level, like with, for example, visual perception or visual motor perceptual integration, it can be more or less sophisticated. But on a very basic level, it's our ability to perceive sensory information that is coming in through our sensory receptors. The next term, discrimination, refers to our ability to distinguish or differentiate between different sensory inputs. So discrimination, or the amount or intensity or particular type of sensory input. For example, discrimination in the tactile or touch system means that we can tell the difference between textures, between temperatures, between the feel of various tools in our hands. So, discrimination has a lot to do with praxis, or the ability to engage in skilled movement, because in order to do so, we need to discriminate tactily. Now, we have discrimination in most all of our senses, and it has to do, again, with this ability to distinguish or interpret what's going on with our senses. So it gives us more refinement of information than perception might. The next term is registration. And registration has to do with whether our central nervous system actually notices input coming in from the environment through our sensory receptors. So if it's not registered, then we have no reaction because it doesn't get sent to the brain for processing. Reactivity or modulation is the next term, and this is a term that's had a lot of different names. Up until recently, it was called modulation, and now we tend to use the term reactivity because it follows along with the term that's used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, the most recent DSM. So when we talk about reactivity, we're using the language that's used in that particular book, and is used commonly to characterize how the arousal and behavioral responses to sensory input work. So again, it has to do with regulation of arousal, in other words, how alert our nervous system is, and also our behavioral responses to sensory input. So when we think about reactivity, this is the area where typically we're kind of drawn back to ideas like overreactivity and underreactivity, and our nervous system's response to stimuli that may or may not be in keeping with what is actually coming in from the environment. An example of that would be if an individual has overreactivity in the auditory or hearing system, sounds that the person with a typically functioning nervous system would not find particularly loud or noxious or irritating, the person who has overreactivity would, in fact, experience discomfort and attempt to avoid that type of auditory input. And we see this a lot in schools with kids who cover their ears when the toilet flushes, or the vacuum cleaner goes on, or the bell rings, or a fire truck goes by with a siren on. So reactivity is what we commonly think of in terms of over and under responsivity to input. The next term is processing. And processing has to do with, again, what the nervous system is doing with the sensory information that's coming in from all the senses. So when we think about sensory integration dysfunction, it's not because one has a deficiency in the ability to see. So it doesn't have to do with blindness or nearsightedness or farsightedness. It has to do with the brain processing information that's coming in through the visual system in this instance, or any of the other sensory systems, and then making sense of that information as it comes in. At this point, I'm going to introduce you to some additional terminology, and it is commonly heard within the realm of sensory integration theory, evaluation, and treatment. So, bilateral integration and sequencing is one of those terms, and it's also a piece of identifying, in particular, a type of sensory integration dysfunction. So, if we unpack that, bilateral integration is the coordination or the integration of the two sides of the body, and by extension, the two sides of the brain. And that is to perform synchronized and sequential movements. So the sequencing part is the two sides of the body and the brain are coordinated, and therefore the motor system can sequence activity in a coordinated and fluid manner. And the picture of the boy kicking a soccer ball is a good example of this. He's engaging in asymmetrical bilateral integration. One arm is out, the other arm is back, and his legs are doing different things so that he can balance, he can kick the ball, and he can perform a sequence of activities that lead to that functional participation in the thing that we call playing ball. The next term is body scheme, and body scheme refers to an unconscious map of the physical body that's stored in the brain. If an individual, child or adult, has a poor body scheme, they don't have a good map or a good mental representation of their own body in their brain. And so that can lead to difficulties with sensory integration and also with motor competence. Postural ocular control refers to motor control of the body position and eye movement. So it's the combination of using our eyes and our core muscles to control our bodies. And with sensory integration, if we think about especially our vestibular system in relationship to our ocular or vision system, the two are very closely linked. And evidence of this is if a person can stand on their foot, one foot, without losing their balance with eyes open, but the minute that you ask them to close their eyes, their balance is compromised because they no longer are mediating their balance with vision. They have to just rely on their vestibular system to control their postural stability and their balance. So, postural ocular control is important when we think about praxis. Speaking of praxis, here we are. So, praxis is the ability to conceptualize and organize novel actions. Excuse me for 1 second. My apologies. So, praxis comes in a series of steps. Um, To start with, we have an idea of what we'd like to accomplish, and that idea is called ideation. In other words, developing a thought about what is it that I would like to do. Following the idea is the motor planning phase of praxis. And motor planning is, just as it says, planning for a novel or unfamiliar motor action or set of actions. This doesn't happen consciously, but what we're expecting and hoping that our nervous system will do is to be able to plan the how, why, the temporal or timing requirements, the sequencing requirements for an activity. And the activity in this picture is riding a bicycle with training wheels. Following that, we engage in the execution of the motor activity. In other words, the actual doing with the muscles of the activity. And completing the praxis cycle is a feedback, in other words, getting information from the environment and from the senses about what's happened motorically, and then feeding forward into the praxis cycle again. So, just to review briefly, praxis is comprised of ideation, motor planning, execution, feedback, and feed forward. For those of you that are particularly interested in praxis, the second lecture will focus on praxis almost exclusively. The Just Right Challenge is a term that was coined by Jean Ayres, and what it means is that an activity facilitates skill building while simultaneously being responsive and adjustable to the current level of function. In other words, a Just Right challenge is an activity that's not too hard and not too easy, but falls in that just right place where a child is challenged or an adult is challenged to engage with the activity, but it's not so difficult that it is basically insurmountable, and it's not so easy that it represents no difficulty whatsoever. And this is the place where sensory integration therapy actually um, it's where we find evidence that sensory integration is happening and that the intervention that we're engaging in with the child, in collaboration with the child, is actually working. So the Just Right challenge is provided, the child engages in activity, and then they make something called an adaptive response. So the adaptive response is this outcome of a Just Right challenge. And the adaptive response is defined as a purposeful, goal directed counteraction to a sensory experience. So if we think about it, the information comes in from our senses, is sent up to our brain and processed, and then we make a motor response. And when the all of those three pieces are working in conjunction with each other, we have the Just Right challenge and we're able to make an adaptive response. If the activity is too hard, then we won't see an adaptive response in our clients. And if the activity is too easy, either we will experience no learning curve or changing growing edge, or the child will just engage in a very rote manner in the activity. In the first module, there's quite a bit of information that's directly linked to neurology. So why do we focus on this and why do we study neuro? There's a number of reasons. First of all, it gives us information about development. And when we think about development, we think about typical development, but also atypical development. In other words, we get our information about what a child should be doing motorically um, from typical development. And we also get our information about when a child is either advanced or delayed from comparing him or her to what the typical child experiences in terms of development. When we study neurology, we also get knowledge of the physiological systems that underlie sensory integration. And this is important because sensory integration is a bottom up theory. So, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, in occupational therapy, we tend to think of things from the top down. We tend to think about engaging in activity and engaging in activity, And if our clients cannot successfully do that, then we break down the activity or the occupation into more and more component parts until we understand the underlying systems and aspects of the systems that may not be functioning appropriately. With a bottom up theory, like sensory integration, we look at the component parts, and in our case, we look at the sensory systems. And then on top of that, we build more and more skill till we get to the level of activity or engagement in occupation. And knowing about physiology is helpful in that process, whether you're going top down or bottom up. Our understanding of neurology also grounds our assessment or our evaluation process. So when we see what's happening behaviorally with a child when we're engaging in evaluation, we can go back to a neurological foundation to help us understand exactly what's going on. And as we know, the more clearly and precisely we can evaluate what's going on with the child, the more clearly and precisely we can actually intervene. I think I just spoke to this point, but in addition to grounding assessment, our knowledge about neurology informs our intervention efforts. So, for example, if we know what the anatomy and physiology of the vestibular system is, in other words, the apparatus, how the semicircular canals, the utricle and saccule function, and what stimulates those sensory receptors in different ways. So, this is just an example, and it can happen in any of the sensory systems. The more we understand how that works, the more effective we can be in our intervention efforts. If if we just think, oh, the vestibular system is about balance, well, yes, it is. And we can get some good facilitation with children if we just think vestibular balance. But if we actually know what the role of all of the parts and pieces of the vestibular system are, we can tailor our intervention more precisely and specifically. Knowledge of neurology also helps to increase our credibility. This is with families and caregivers, with professionals, and with team members. So, the more we're able to explain how sensory integration works, the better. And I'm not sure where those of you that are listening work or where you're at in your training, but when the topic of sensory integration comes up, it's a difficult topic to explain. And so the more clear we can be about how sensory integration works and Ayres sensory integration in particular, the more we're trusted by all of the stakeholders who are working with or taking care of our clients. There's probably other reasons for studying neurology, but those are the main ones. And I would refer you back to the Module 1 slideshows to get more information. Okay, so we've reached the point in this presentation where, fortunately or unfortunately, we're confronted with statistics. So I'm going to spend about 3 or 4 slides talking about something called factor analysis. And we see factor analysis in Module 1. We also see a couple different studies of factor analysis that we'll be going over in a little bit more detail. But it's important for you to understand what factor analysis is. You don't need to be able to do it yourself, but it's important to understand what it is because it helps us to quantify and also classify different types of sensory integration dysfunction. And again, when we think about evaluation and quantifying specifically what's going on with a child and what's not working, the more closely we can describe that and understand different categories of sensory integration dysfunction, the better. So, factor analysis is a statistical method that's used to describe variability among observed correlated variables in terms of a potentially lower number of unobserved variables called factors. Now, that sounds, when I say it, like a mouthful. So let me break it down for you. When we talk about quantifying or classifying different kinds of sensory integration dysfunction, what typically happens in a factor analysis is that the charts and the notes on a large number of children are reviewed and they're fed into um, a statistical analysis program. And then they're crunched. So those numbers are crunched. And what comes out is how the different children um, present in different areas. And from that presentation, right? So it's based on evaluation results. So, based on the numbers that come out of that, we can group children into different types of sensory integration dysfunction based on their patterns on their evaluations. And to date, the SIPT, the sensory integration and praxis tests, have been the test that has been used for factor analyses. Why is factor analysis important? So, when we attempt to discover how the variation amongst kids actually forms a pattern and how the all of their evaluation scores kind of fit together into patterns, it enables us to put some labels or names on different kinds of sensory integration challenges. Once we can label and name it, it gives us information for intervention. So the first factor analysis study is that we're going to look at is Mulligan from 1998. So Shelley Mulligan had a gigantic sample of over 10,000 children that she did a factor analysis on, and she identified these particular factors. And this is the reason why we do a factor analysis. So she inputted once again, and I realize that I'm repeating myself, but it's complex information. So bear with me. So she took over 10,000, the records of over 10,000 kids, and she put it into statistical software and she crunched the numbers, seeing what sort of factors, or you might think of them as patterns, would emerge. The first one was a bilateral integration and sequencing factor. And we spoke about bilateral integration and sequencing a little bit earlier in the lecture. Again, bilateral integration and sequencing is how we use our body in coordination to sequence activities. So, from a set of, and the SIPT has upwards of 20 different tests associated with it. So, even though there was no one test called bilateral integration and sequencing, the scores of children on a variety of tests grouped together and formed a pattern called bilateral integration and sequencing. And we're talking about difficulties with that. The second pattern she found was somatopraxis. So, somato being of the body and having to do with the subtests on the SIPT that measure tactile and proprioceptive input as they relate to praxis. So, somato of the body, tactile and proprioceptive as they relate to using the body in a skilled fashion for motor activity. So that was the second factor. The third factor was visuopraxis. So if we take that term apart, visuo, meaning of the visual system, and praxis, again, the skilled, coordinated ability to use one's body. What Mulligan found was that there was a factor that related visual integration and with praxis. And then finally, somatosensory processing. So Mulligan found that again, the senses that are of the body, there was a pattern of sensory processing in those senses that when it was not working well, it rose to the top as a factor or a particular type of pattern of sensory integration dysfunction. She also found that there was a pattern that had to do with postural and ocular movement. And again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, there's a very strong connection between our ability to maintain our posture and make adjustments in our posture and our visual system and ability to move. So that was the first study. The second study that we're going to talk about was by Melo et al. In 2011. The sample is quite a bit smaller than Mulligan's sample, but still robust at 273 clients. And this team of researchers also identified factors. They came up with visuo and somatosensory dyspraxia. So same as Mulligan, but putting together the visual system and the somatosensory systems, leading to difficulty with praxis. They also found vestibular and bilateral integration and sequencing. And notice that the bilateral integration and sequencing is still there. We've just added vestibular to it, meaning that on tests that measure vestibular function, that was part of the pattern that arose with difficulties with bilateral integration and sequencing. Then there was a discrimination factor. And again, thinking back to the beginning of the lecture, discrimination is the ability to precisely differentiate and understand sensation on a very specific level. So the factor identified difficulties with both tactile and visual discrimination and found that those patterns went together. And then there was a pattern of tactile defensiveness and attention. This is a pattern that has to do with reactivity, another term that we discussed early on. So tactile defensiveness or tactile overreactivity and how that relates to attention. And typically, for those of us that are working clinically, we see that these go together in terms of a child being tactily defensive and inattentive because they are so consumed with the discomfort of tactile sensation and or the threat or anticipation of unwanted tactile sensation. All right, so that wraps it up for the factor analysis. I hope that that made some sense and helped you out in terms of interpreting what was going on. You know, the take home message is basically that we have patterns of sensory integration difficulty or dysfunction, and those patterns are based on results from evaluation. They're not just made up. So they're based on data that's coming from a whole bunch of real live kids. We can use those factors or those patterns of dysfunction to inform our intervention efforts. Okay, we're almost at the end, and now we're going to look at praxis versus modulation, or reactivity. Praxis, again, is the motor system outcomes of sensory integration. And when Jean Ayres was doing the bulk of her work, she thought a lot about praxis, both in the Southern California sensory integration tests and with the SIPT, the sensory integration and praxis tests. In fact, praxis is in the name of the test. So she focused a lot on the motor outcomes of sensory integration. The only way we can really measure a child's improvement in sensory integration is through motor outcomes, right? So through using a just right challenge and getting an adaptive response. And when we look for adaptive responses over time and with more intervention, we're looking for more and more sophisticated adaptive responses. We contrast that with modulation or reactivity, which are the self-regulatory outcomes of sensory integration. So those have to do with what we see in terms of behavior, alertness, resilience, emotional responsiveness, and over responsiveness or under responsiveness. So everything that is not directly motor connected, we can classify under this heading of modulation. How well a child self-regulates given their sensory integration status. And these are the two big categories that we typically see in kids who come to us clinically looking for sensory integration therapy. In summary, we've looked a little bit at theory, we've looked at sensory systems, patterns of dysfunction, bilateral integration, praxis, and reactivity. And those are some of the building blocks that go into sensory integration theory and then feed into the evaluation process and also our intervention efforts. If you have questions or you need more information, please feel free to contact me at melisak13@gmail.com, or you can always write to Classy or Katie Estrada, and she will forward any
Thank you so
questions
much,
to me.
Melissa. That was
Thank you for your time
wonderful.
and
As
attention,
Melissa
and see you
mentioned, if you
next
have any
month.
questions, please feel free to email Melissa, or I've typed my email address into the chat box. My email is kayestrada@cl-asi.org. We look forward to you joining hopefully next month. We'll be offering 5 more of these sessions the third Wednesday of each month at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And thank you again, Melissa. It was wonderful to have you, and we look forward to the session next month.